Okay, the Commission to Improve Standards of Conduct will now come to order. Um, First of all, I'll just have the commissioners introduce themselves, please.
Nico Slebrins, Common Cause of Hawaii.
Aloha, Robert Harris with the Hawaii State Ethics Commission.
Jen,
Hello, I'm Janet Mason from the League of Women Voters.
do we have any on Zoom? Kristen? Okay, maybe you come on.
Hi, sorry. Kristen Izumi Nitao, Executive Director, Campaign Spending Commission. Good afternoon.
Okay, and we have a couple of commissioners excused for other work conflict that they have right now. The first item on the agenda is the approval of the minutes of April 17. We're going to defer that for now, still undergoing some changes. Janet?
August 17th.
Oh, yeah, August 17, 2022. So we're going to defer that to next meeting for approval. Then we'll go first to public testimony, and the public testimony should be limited to legislative process, the legislature. I see Kat. Hello, Kat. You ready to go?
Anyone? Oh, wait, here, Kat, are you
You're
trying?
muted, Kat.
Okie dokie.
Okay,
Thank you
Kat.
so much. Thank you so much, Chair Foley and commissioners, for the privilege to testify today. I've been working on a lot of different and looking at the world and seeing how other governments operate and really trying to understand what are the best things that we could do to make our legislature really democratic. So as you know, I'm not a big proponent for mandatory minimums or laws that we hope will change behavior, because we know that they don't always. The commission seems kind of intent on making more laws rather than looking deeper into the motivation of the wrongdoing at the legislature. We have laws, and some of the people who made those laws broke those laws. So when people are encouraging bribes in any form, not just money, but, you know, different gratuities, it's not about the law. It's about that person's greed. Wouldn't it be better and more of a deterrent to levy a fine for people who abuse the public trust? I'm not talking about $10,000 or $20,000. I'm talking about a whopping fine that impacts the person's personal finances, and not paid by campaign funds or from their special friends, paid out of the person's personal finances. The real problem I see is the system. The system encourages greed, selfishness, and conflicts of interest by allowing them to go unchallenged. Today's Civil Beat has an article entitled "An Explosive Report on the Former State Auditor Describes an Office in Turmoil." The legislature knew about these problems in 2014, 2016. The legislative auditor was established under their authority. What did they do about the problems at that office? How did they protect their own staff? The legislative auditor was established under the legislature. The acting auditor, Jan Yamani, who was acting at the time, left the state, and she's now the head of the Honolulu Ethics Commission. Hawaii needs deep systemic change that comports with community values and democratic principles. Democracy is a form of government built on a foundation of ethical principles, and it cannot survive unless those principles are honored and protected. Values matter because how we adopt laws is as important as the laws that we adopt. And all of us are charged with protecting the self-governing principles that are the foundations of our great nation. Unethical leadership can undermine the democratic principles and even democracy itself. Values-based leadership is essential to preserving and protecting democratic principles, and there are at least 3 widely recognized moral values that are central to ensuring the governing process is democratic: truthfulness, justice, and temperance. Thank you. I'll send this in.
Thank you, Kat. Any questions for Kat?
Thank you, Kat. That was very eloquent.
Okay, if there's no questions.
Nicely stated,
thank you very
Kat.
much.
Sorry.
Thank you very much, Kat. Further testimony, there not being, I'm going to turn it over then to our Vice Chair, Robert Harris, to lead the discussion on legislative process and also a draft nepotism bill. Robert?
Thank you very much, Chair. Representative Ward, would you like to join us up in the front? I'm
Thank you.
Just as a brief introduction, Representative Ward was one of our invited guest speakers from last session. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to work, and I'm very much appreciative, Pat, that you're able to make the time to come today and join us. Similar to last time, we asked your colleagues to try to stay within 5 minutes with a few minutes for question and answer afterwards. But without further ado, if you want to go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Harris. Mr. Chairman,
Thank
I
you.
stand on my testimony.
Oh, you can summarize it.
Members of the commission, this is a dramatic reenactment of what happens too often in the committees. When the public is denied what I'm going to say, because I stand on my testimony, this happens in the majority of the committees at the majority of the time. And if you guys haven't read this that I just handed out, you have no idea what I'm going to say. How many of you have read it? I don't expect anybody to read it. Well, Robert, you've read it. But the people in, like where Kat Brady is, they have no way of getting hold of it because it's like 10 minutes available to the legislators before the hearing is done. And the people who are the public don't get it until the day after. So I think what I'm talking about are some of the structural flaws. And I didn't mean to be overly dramatic, but I wanted to show you what the frustration is for some of us who time and again here, Mr. Chair, Mrs. Chair, I stand on my testimony. It is like, for what reason? You're denying the public access to information and then the discussions. And this is not to say how the chairs judge. You guys want to speed up, get them in, get them out. It's like you've already made up your mind. If we really want a hearing, we got to have a dialogue the same way we have it on the floor. And it's not happening. Having said that, let me go back to what I was going to begin by saying is thank you guys for serving. Thank you for what, as Kat alluded to, you guys have the moral compass, probably even more than the church about building character, being honest, being just. So your role is very important. That's why it's an honor to come and speak to you. And this is kind of a cumulative frustration for me in this process for a number of years. I've been in 12 sessions, 12 terms, and it doesn't seem to change too much. So let me very quickly go through what was otherwise my Civil Beat article, which outlines some of the key structural difficulties. But let me say up front as a disclosure, I do not think the inherent character of Senator English and Representative Cullen is corrupt. I think they're good individuals. However, the system tempted them and their weakness gave into it. Why is that the case? Some of the things I'm going to outline will
By the way,
indicate.
we did read your civil beat.
Oh, you did read it?
Yes. Oh, I didn't know it was the same as your testimony, but we did read your civil beat.
Okay, because basically the structure is some of the things that are flaws that we can correct, which you guys have the opportunity to correct, is very, very good. If we had a balanced state party system, we'd probably have the rules changes. We wouldn't have to come to you as we are today. The problem is, I refer to on page 2 of my testimony is the big five. The big five basically run the legislative agenda here. From the speaker, the pyramid goes down to the chair of finance and to the majority leader, and then to there's one other individual, the vice speaker, sorry. So those five kind of keep the 18 chairs in sync or in tune with what otherwise those big five want to have happen. And why I would say that is the big five, because often the bills that get before committee, they're already a foregone conclusion. 90% are going to pass. If it gets to the floor, probably 99% of the bills are going to pass. So there's not really an invitation structurally to have debate or to have really a lot of flow from the public. Having said that, the way that it's structured, there are ways that that can be improved. And I think some of the things that Robert, you mentioned are, hey, let's have before a bill can be killed, i.e. the famous quote by Senator English, hey, it's a piece of cake to kill a bill. I think he said, it's easy to kill a bill. That should never be a statement out of any legislator's mouth. That is an anathema. But the way it's structured is that if you're a chair, you don't like the bill for whatever reason, you don't have to say anything. You say, we will hold this bill. No votes, no comments, nada, and the bill dies. Now, Civil Beat is going to start connecting votes with money, which I think is clever, a deep dive, if you will, and even who introduces bills and then who votes for the bills and who gets money from those who benefit from the bills. We've never had that kind of investigative reporting. I think it's good. I think it's a move forward. It's rather creative and it's innovative. Some of the other structural authority, I've already said too much authority in those 5 individuals. The other thing is I guess I'm going to give evidence of why the members are taught to abide by that. Because if anybody votes no on a committee, even though chairs will say, well, vote your conscience, they almost overly politely, gratuitously say, you know, Mr. Chair, nothing wrong with this, but I like that. And if you don't mind, I'm going to vote no on this. Which is, if you're transparent about your opposition, you get a bye. But it's always so ingratiating, as if making no is no, which leads to the other thing. I hope you guys consider getting rid of the with reservations. If a Democrat votes with reservation, it means no. I'm giving you the subculture. If a Republican votes with reservations, it means, yeah, there's probably got some bad stuff in it. But it's good enough to keep with it. So it's kind of with the wiggle worm, depending on what side of the aisle. So going up and down would be very good. But Judge, these are in the rules that's allowable. So I know you guys are outside of the rules because we vote on the rules, but if you guys have a legislative report that says strongly, get rid of this reservations, give people an up or a down so they know, that would be, I think, a step forward for new standards of conduct.
We will be making recommendations on the rules.
Recommendations which will be for rules changes.
Yes.
Terrific. That is terrific. A couple of other reality factors here. Being that I have, and by the way, if this was a hearing for billions of dollars, I would get 2 minutes and someone in the staff would ring a bell and say, okay, hurry up. And then the chair would say, would you summarize your testimony? Almost an impolite way of saying, look, we don't want to really hear anymore. And most of the time, you guys in the committees are looking at your phone or looking at your computer and you're doing stuff that like, hey, I know what I'm going to do. I know what I'm going to vote. And you guys are actually looking at me. So I'm honored because that's not the way usually people are treated when they're giving testimony. So that is another factor of 2 minutes or die. And it seems as though the way stand on your testimony, the way I dramatically started, was the way that they get a lot of testimony in, but very, very brief. And then discussion is very limited, which brings me to the other part. If this was the COVID hearing, and I gave testimony and other people gave testimony, then you, Mr. Chair, would bring us out into the hallway. And you say, what do you guys think of this? Well, how about you, sir? Are you up? Are you okay? You got any changes you want to make? Are there some implications that your district has a problem with? So it gets to be cleared for a go ahead. Generally, that should be something that is open to the public, but it's not. And in COVID, it was breakout rooms. You guys all know the breakout rooms. So there's so many ways to get it. There's so many ways that we could be more transparent, but we have avoided that, or we've decided not to do it. Transparency means a lot of sunlight. I think probably that covers the majority of the issues. And in conclusion, I think if there are some structural changes, it avoids the English Cullen temptation to break the rules. Again, everybody has character flaws, and some are weaker and stronger in different individuals. But when you've got a system by which these individuals are tempted beyond their ability, financially or otherwise, I think we have a formula for corruption. So with that, Mr. Chair, I would yield to any questions, or I could speak on and on even further on this.
I could ask a couple of questions, Representative.
Okay.
Thank you very much for your testimony, and I'm pleased to see I did ask you to summarize it, and wouldn't allow you to stand up. So that, I scored a point. But thank you so much. We appreciate your experience. So essentially, your testimony comes down to greater democracy in terms of decision making, more transparency in terms of decision making. Would you say that's a?
Yeah, openness, transparency, let the people hear or listen. I know we don't allow them to speak in some cases. And if you want to go to another pet peeve, if this was a conference committee, you're the chair, I'm the chair, we are the only ones allowed to speak. You guys, it's an insult to your intelligence. You cannot speak, you cannot say anything. I don't know if you can even belch. Those things are a facade, because before you and I as the chairs meet outside, we've already made up our mind. It's a charade. It's not the democratic open process. So the committee system is a bit of a charade. It's a lot of drama. So I'm just picking that up and running with it. But transparency is the key. Sunlight is the best disinfectant, as the judges say.
One other question, not addressed, I don't think, in your testimony, but something the commission's looking at, and some of your colleagues addressed it last session, our last hearing, term limits. Do you have any position on term limits?
Yes, even with 12 terms under my belt, I introduced that the first 2, 3, 4 years, and people wouldn't even hear it. They wouldn't hear it. If you look at Civil Beat, when they asked that a question to all the standard, I would say you probably got 80 to 90% saying, no, the term limits comes on election day. Nonsense. If you want to have change, you got to have term limits. Term limits keeps the vested interests from solidifying, ossifying, if you will, and the status quo will always remain without it. So definitely for that. Definitely for that. One other fine point that Robert gave me in terms of one of the points that he said, the sense of identifying who drafted the bill, finding out who sponsored the bill. And I would say it's not who drafted it, but who sponsored it. Who was the one who said, not HMI or HMSO, who sponsored the bill, and then track it through with campaign finance and other sorts of things. And you can probably see a little bit of connecting the dots. So that was one thing I wanted to take an issue with the other points that you had mentioned. The public notices, the public, Kat is one of the greatest testifiers, and always frustrated with, I didn't get the information. I didn't get the notice. I had to go to the dentist and nobody told me anything. Look, this is a technology where Zoom, if you saw the Crazy Rich Asians, within the second that woman walked into the bar or the man walked into the bar with another woman, Singapore knew it within 5 seconds. And it was in a prayer meeting, if you remember, Crazy Rich Asians. With that kind of technology and the way that we use excuses, well, we can't really do that. Nonsense. The political will is what's missing. The political will is what is needed. And again, I point to you guys as part of the moral compass. You guys can keep the pressure to make a change and to make a difference. One other thing I want to address, if I may, the legislative session, guys, don't do it permanent, because what we're going to do is fill you with more minutia of bills and bills. We already get 3,000 bills. We're only 60 days. I don't think that's a good suggestion when you say, well, we're going to make you a full-time legislature. It's more of doing with what time you've got and using the best thing for the bills with what time you have. So making it a full-time legislature, I definitely not encourage that. So in conclusion, thank you, guys. If there's other questions.
Can I follow up on that particular
Yes.
point? So Representative Ward, I think what was discussed is not necessarily making the legislature full-time, but potentially having a longer session just to have the opportunity for more notice, more opportunity for input, et cetera.
That I would agree with.
That the second part, which you may not agree with, but I'd like to get your input on, was potentially looking at trying to make legislators full-time with the idea that you could then also say that they cannot have second jobs, second other kinds of engagements. Your job is to be full-time serving. the
Sir,
public.
I am a full-time legislator. Because if you're really paying attention to your
And a lot-
constituents, you
and a
gotta
lot-
be full-time.
And a lot of people are, and I think the idea is to try to recognize that in terms of essentially saying that you're full-time and trying to maybe limit some of the other potential other jobs people can take and the inherent conflicts that might come out as a result of that.
What probably many of my colleagues will say, okay, you're gonna have to jack up my pay. And that's gonna be another issue of tax increases or other sort of things. If you remember when we just started the pandemic, there was a pay raise to get kicked in. Some of us, including myself, did a postponement of 1 year. The speaker came in, provoked to jealousy and had a 2-year postponement. We don't get it until January of this year coming up. Those kinds of things, if you're full-time, it opens it that. But I would say one of the things we don't do in the legislature is pilot stuff. We make it a law and then we say, well, I didn't know the unintended consequence. We should do more piloting. I would say, let's go instead of 60 days, go to 90 days. See if that'll solve these issues. That makes a lot of sense. But let me, before I run out of your patience, just give me one more opportunity to give you a pet peeve. And this is after 20 years in the legislature. We are so unscientific in our approach. We do not use metrics. We don't use science. We don't use quantitative data. We use qualitative data, anecdotal case studies. We don't have metrics on how much bills cost, the fiscal notes. We've put in bill. That should be one of the things you guys should do. We should do fiscal notes because that to me is the only responsible thing to do. How much does this thing cost if we're going to do these things? Because you get the warm and fuzzies and then you forget about the fiscal responsibility. But I'm known, and Kat, if you're listening, she always knows. I said, well, how many people are on the mainland who are getting sick because they're in prisons for something? Give me numbers. We have such a way of passing bills without numbers. Anyways, that's a pet peeve. I'll get it off my chest. You guys know it. And I have another question.
Thank you for being here, Rep. Ward. The chair already reminded us that we will have recommendations about changes in the rules. But my question is, how does the compliance work? They don't carry the force of law. So when rules are broken, is there an effective way to enforce compliance?
You're pointing out a very obvious thing that legislators always reminded. If you can't enforce it, don't pass it. But we got a lot of stuff that's on the books that's enforced. But I think there's an adage that comes out of the neighborhood board and the other grassroots system. If the people rise up, the politicians will follow. If there's enough support, like for term limits, the politicians will follow. But they're always kind of within their own state of mind until they see that, oh my God, it's an election year. Like we better move quickly on that. So enforcement is key, but some of the stuff is the funding and the specific stuff in the bill as to how it's going to be enforced. And because we don't have metrics to measure what we expect, it just kind of goes off into aspirational sort of la-la land.
Actually, my question is about enforcement of the rules.
Enforcement of the rules.
Yes.
Okay, I told you in the beginning, if we had a two-party system, we wouldn't need to have you guys come in and intervene. We'd have it changed on the floor where these things are negotiated. But right now, the rules are going to be by the moral power and suasion that you have as this new standards of conduct that the speaker asked for, that if he doesn't do it, it's going to create a bit of a backlash, I would think. So the way you write this, and hopefully you're going to market it to a degree that people know what you guys have done, because there's a lot of people out there saying who don't trust us with the corruption that's there. And then some of the things that I just learned earlier, that some people intervene in the process of when things are enforced. There is an intervention by a big league in the private or in this building that prevents the justice from occurring the way it should be, the way America was structured, the way the rule of law is supposed to happen. And that's very frustrating. But you're right. If you have a law and you don't enforce it, you're just kind of decorating things so you look good, but you don't do anything with what you're dressed up to be.
Thank you.
So the people will lead the politicians. They will follow. Yes, sir.
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you for being here, and I will very vociferously agree that there's a need for more robust discussion in the process. And I would also like to see, potentially the chairs issue recommendations in writing before committee hearings and make that publicly available, but I'm not sure that that's practical. In terms of deferring bills, do you see any utility in having something like a checklist where instead of a chair just exercising a silent pocket veto, that they actually, specify, some reason why, this bill was being held? And on a related note, do you also think that perhaps when a chamber decides to pass a piece of legislation that it should get at least one hearing in the opposite chamber? Because right now it's often the case that, for example, on a bill that you would certainly oppose, on reproductive choice, passed out of the Senate very quickly, and then it was held in the House. This was, of course, post-ops. So could you address both
Let
of
me
those
start with the
things?
last one. I think the virtue of the bicameral system where you have two houses is where the checks and balances. So I'm not sure you'd want to toy with that one, even though I get your point about you get heard here. But you know what the strategy of most legislators are? They get a companion bill in the House and a Senate bill that gets a companion in the House, a House bill that gets a companion in the Senate. So they're kind of putting their money on both black and red, if you will. And that's how they try to get the best part. By the way, you were very polite when you said instead of holding a bill, deferring a bill. That's the euphemism for I'm going to kill the bugger.
Yeah.
That's the euphemism of it. Your point about, is there a better way to defer it with a checklist? I would just say an openness that the chair, if they're going to say, my position that I gave you guys earlier is that it should be voted on. Now, whether you can give the power to the chair and just say, okay, here's the reasons, 1, 2, 3, which on occasion, sometimes they would do, but I'm not sure that would be the openness and the sunlight that I think transparency would require if we really want to be democratic about the process.
And final question, in terms of bills that are introduced by request, do you see any benefit in whether it's from the speaker, whether it's from the Senate president, or even a legislator identifying who the sponsor of that bill is forthrightly?
You bet your bippy on that, of course.
Yeah,
when you
I
see the name
I
and the
agree.
power behind it, when some names bring shuddering and others laughter, that's there's a very obvious pecking order, and I'm sure you guys all know about that. But identifying, but generally, all we have to do is BR by request, and so we hide kind of those things. But I think it should be obviously more transparent. Madam.
I want to make sure I understand your suggestion about voting on all the bills. Are you suggesting that the committee would vote on all the bills and then the chair would make a recommendation?
No, the chair would make a recommendation and then we would vote on it,
Okay.
but which we do when it's voted to pass. But when it's hold, it's like one person's decision. That's where the short circuiting of the democratic process. So vote to hold is like a vote to pass it.
Just to maybe make sure this point's clear, if you don't mind me following up on
Sure.
that briefly. So this is on all bills that are heard, correct?
All bills that are heard. Yeah, I didn't mean that every bill should be heard. There's got to be some weaning away. Otherwise, I know as a freshman, I'd introduce 50, 60 bills like Sam Sloan did. But then we got it down to where I think we're required 10, 5, 10. I mean, it's really down, but we still end up with 3,000 bills. So there's a lot. So for practical purposes, if we extend though, we can probably handle a lot more bills. Probably could do that. And if we have a way of getting the testimony to the legislators 10 minutes, not 10 minutes, how about like one day or at least 10 hours before the hearing? And my sense is, well, I don't want to speak out of school, but I don't think a lot of my colleagues read the bills. If it's over 10 pages, I know for sure they don't read it. If it's 3 to 5 to 7, yeah, probably. But when you got 3,000 bills and you see the title, it probably doesn't engender total absorption in the process. The point of this is, and in my conclusion, there are structural things that can be done. There are individual things, the character of the people who are standing on this side in the elected position. But there are structural things that we've seen people tripped up by. Therefore, I commend you for taking this and running with it, and hopefully something will come of it. But again, as the moral compass, without this committee, I think we would probably be into more trouble into the future. So thank you for this opportunity to be here and for hearing me out. And I really enjoyed getting questions asked, because that really, by the way, I'm known for the guy who asks too many questions in the hearings. And I'm not telling you how many times I've been shut down, but if there's not a dialogue, all you've got is the chair, the superior decision-making in everything that you want, you get. And if somebody's asking questions that get in the way of that, particularly if you want to get in and go, whatever you want to do for lunch, it's not open and a process. Maybe I'm naive and I think democracy is a very serious thing that we should do. We should be open. We don't have to go to direct democracy, but we should have everybody heard and every opportunity. And in the marketplace of ideas, the best ideas should float and the bad ideas should go down. And I'm not sure that the position we've got now does that.
I hope you appreciate this in the sense of humor that it's intended. Can you please summarize? No, thank you very much.
I would just
That's a
like
good
to
point.
add, Representative Ward, I'm a longtime observer of the legislature, and I can say you have been very effective as the loyal opposition.
Well, I take that as a grand compliment, Judge. Thank you so much. And thank all of you for what you're doing. I know that it's not for the money, it's for the betterment of the people of Hawaii and the state of Hawaii. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Aloha.
Chair, I understand that we have somebody who wants to offer public testimony.
Rona, we have one person who wanted to offer public testimony, and we began with Representative Ward before she was available. If she's available now, she can offer her testimony. I have seen her written testimony and read it, but she's welcome to offer her oral testimony as well. Please.
Aloha, thank you so much to this committee. My name is Shauna Kukila. I'm Ilo Hawaii, and I'm a former legislative aide with the Senate in 2021. So I wanted to offer some of my testimony based on my experience. This testimony is my personal testimony and does not represent any of the agencies or organizations that I employed with or volunteer with. First, I want to say that in my testimony, written testimony, I mentioned Senator Chris Lee and what he had talked about in the August 17th hearing. And I wanted to say that he's a fine legislator, and none of my words were meant to be directed at him personally. So my words were meant to just reflect some of the things that he had mentioned in his testimony. So mahalo for taking my testimony today. I look forward to seeing what I call Pono policy come out of this. So if you did read my testimony from, I think it was August 17th, about Pono policy, I'm not sure if I'm the only one that ever came up with this, but I did outline some of the things that you could do as a 4-point process to achieving Pono policy. And this could cut down on the number of bills that the legislators actually have to look at. It's similar to SMA, and it could be done with a Pono policy group of appointed, vetted, and retired people such as yourselves who know about things that need to be looked at within a piece of legislation. My proposal would be someone from the judiciary, someone from the legislature, and someone from the executive branch. So, and one of the things that I wanted to say about this whole process that you're doing now is that you're speaking with a lot of the gatekeepers who would benefit from the status quo. And I mahalo Rep. Ward for not being the status quo and for always being that change agent. But we know that everything is political, and we know that those who really have things to say may not want to say them based on their position. They may not want to go against another legislator. So transparency is a very difficult task for anyone in the realm of the state capitol and those who work there. So what I learned about the legislature when I worked there is that it takes a good year to learn, a good session or two to learn really what the process is all about. And one of the things that I did learn is that, yes, there was a pay raise that was scheduled in the middle of the pandemic that the good senator that I worked for was against, and I was very thankful for that. But it also raised the question of how much they make. Now, I'm looking at their salaries just as a person on the outside. I don't know what executive salaries are supposed to be, but for a part-time job, it's pretty good. They're given about $70,000 a year plus per diem, especially if you're a neighbor island senator or legislator. So, and that per diem adds up to a lot of money. So this is not like to complain about any of that. They earn their money. But I would like to say that, you know, many people in Hawaii live off of this or less for a whole year. So this would be a good argument to say, hey, you know, if you really want to know what the people go through and how to write laws that really help us, the people, then why don't you just live within your means like everybody else has to? And perhaps not get other employment, because that does muddy the water. And
Okay.
also, one
Could
more
you
thing.
wind it up, please?
Also, one more thing is when they do come across criminal actions, there should be a trigger response by the judiciary, because they are the checks and balance. So it shouldn't be up to the chair to say whether or not a legislator is, you know, going to incur any kind of consequences. That should be up to the judiciary. So thank you very much for allowing me to speak today. Mahalo.
Thank you. Back to you, Vice Chair.
Thank you very much. Is it possible to pull up the presentation at this time? So we deferred last week a PowerPoint slide, which is intended mostly to try to provoke discussions on some of the concepts that we've gotten both from public input and from our discussions. And, you know, hopefully sort of walk away from today, maybe with a bit of directionality of some of the concepts we want to explore further, what we really want to talk about. So if we go ahead and skip to the next slide. This is a wordy quote. I apologize. I think Robert Heinlein also had a very similar quote that I always loved as a kid, so I jumped at a chance to use it. I think the intent is maybe to say that both democracy in general, but also specifically legislative process is always going to be a process of compromise. And as a result, there's always going to be some dissatisfaction with how it works. Doesn't mean we shouldn't try to make it better, to be clear, but I think we have to recognize, as we maybe talked about this a little bit, that there is some level of you give a little bit in one area, then you sort of have trouble in the other. So there is some level of trying to find balance here as we go through the process. So the first general topic is just fair consideration of bills, trying to make sure that ideas that have been introduced get a fair opportunity for hearing and moving forward. So we can jump to the next slide. The first discussion point that people have brought up is the concept of death by committee referral and a perception perhaps that the referral process isn't either fair or is maybe more subjective. And so one idea, which is not well fleshed out necessarily, is trying to more specifically in the legislative rules spell out how the referral process should occur and try to create some level of objectivity. And then potentially trying to make sure that there is a group versus an individual that is got the ability to look at committee referral. That being said, you know, I think as some of the testifiers have indicated, we have to recognize this is a very fast process. And there's actually also a pretty active process by which bills can be re-referred, recalled, and moved around. So I hesitate to try to maybe be too prescriptive in this regard, but I do think it makes sense to try to talk about some level of objectivity. And I think one thing maybe we could do as a group is maybe try to find out a bit more about how bills currently are referred and try to, you know, hone in on that a bit more as well. Let me just pause here. Is there any discussion from the
My experience in the legislature, one referral works, two referrals, quite often to Ways and Means or Finance, if there is a fiscal, but three referrals is usually the kiss of death. It's really hard to, within the time constraints of the legislature, to get through three committees in one house.
That's 6 committees, that's the kiss of death. Go ahead.
I've already brought up the fact that I'm unhappy to see bills without a fiscal impact go to finance. This happens during the committee referral process, and it also happens if the bill makes it as far as conference. It's been obvious to most people that such a referral is more about a gatekeeping type function, and it is a very opaque kind of thing to do.
I second that sentiment.
Okay. Duly noted. Moving on to the next. So I apologize, it's going to be really hard to read particularly, but I think I can somewhat summarize. We've gotten proposals that all sort of interrelate a little bit to each other and really go to sort of the power of the chair. One is essentially requiring hearings of all bills. A second one would be basically looking at the ability for a chair to defer. We're trying to pull away the chair's ability to defer bills. And then a third concept, which maybe hadn't been brought up, but I put in here because I know the legislature has talked about it previously, which is trying to do term limits for chairs themselves and their specific, I'll use the word subject matter. Essentially, if they're in a certain area, chair of a certain committee, they're not allowed to be chair for more than a period of time. So having quickly said that, let me just kind of summarize maybe a little bit of the pros and cons, and then we can sort of have a quick discussion if people want to try to dive into it. There's also on the next slide some other concepts that maybe potentially also help address some of this as well. And I think the discussion has to sort of be held with sort of all of them on the plate. So obviously, I think one of the benefits of hearing all bills is that you have an opportunity to have an up or down vote. Everybody gets a feeling that their bills get heard or will have the opportunity to get the light of day. Some serious cons would be just the length of time that would involve and how fast the legislature moves. In addition, it could be a significant detriment to the public if, for example, a topic that they're interested in, if there's 10 bills that are all slightly related and all of them get heard, it'd be very difficult to try to testify on all 10 bills versus a chair selecting one of those bills and using that as the vehicle to move forward and have the hearing on. So that is, again, hearing all bills, which I haven't heard maybe proffered from public input as much. But the second topic, which is probably more commonly brought up, is the chair's ability to defer bills. And obviously requiring a full vote would create a lot more transparency on the bills that are heard. One of the concerns might be going to the negatives, that chairs then might be less willing to hear controversial bills or bills that they don't necessarily want to see move forward. Second, there's just maybe the political reality that a lot, that is sort of the fundamental power of a chair that they may not necessarily want to give that up. So again, I think it's subject for us to discuss about whether or not we want to propose sort of a range of options, again, requiring every bill to be voted on the third, or requiring maybe, I think as one of the suggestions, actually having to specify more concretely why a bill is being deferred with more rational, sort of actual reasoning being suggested. And then on the next page, actually talking about maybe giving either that committee or the floor more ability to pull bills that have been deferred, sort of trying to maybe create more pressure to ensure that the power of the deferral isn't abused potentially. We went ahead and moved to the next slide, which I think is good. So recall, which is sort of low, potentially lowering the voting threshold to pull a bill. So it sort of allows maybe a group of people to be able to pull a bill more quickly, or sort of put more pressure to make sure bills actually get full hearing or full conversation, or potentially reduce the number of committee members necessary to require a bill hearing, as sort of a means maybe to try to create a greater broader good. Apologize, I put a bunch of different ideas on the table. Let me just pause for a second, see if anybody has quick reactions or thoughts or discussion.
My sort of general looking at, part of the problem, I don't think having a hearing on all bills is practical, given the number of bills that are introduced, the length of the session, and the internal deadlines we currently have for moving a bill along or a bill dying, essentially. But I am for, and I don't mind the chair initially scheduling hearings or whatnot, as the chair and his committee members, I'm sure they talk. But I do think a number of committee members should be able to overrule the chair as far as if they want a hearing, they get a hearing. If they want to vote, they get a vote. Now, I don't know if the number should be, if you have a 5-member committee, should it be 3 or 2? I don't have a position on that, but I do think the chair should be to be able to overrule. I don't know what the vote is right now to withdraw from committee and put it on the floor, but certainly I've seen it happen. But certainly that's another vehicle. So it's I think in terms of efficiency, the number of bills introduced, the deadlines in the legislature, I don't have a problem with the chair initiating, but I think reasons given are important, and the ability to overrule the chair is also important.
Janet, did you have anything to add?
No, thank you.
Kristen, I know, I think the intent at trying to lower the voting threshold wasn't to get to the point where 1 or 2 members necessarily would have the ability to sort of hold the chair, clumsy wording, hostage, for lack of a better way of phrasing it. Nor was it to say that it had to be a majority of members. The idea is trying to find a threshold somewhere in between. So a, minority faction or vocal faction could potentially sort of push some concepts to the light of day. So the idea is, I think we have to be pragmatic and recognize that there is probably some informal prohibition about overruling a chair for fear that, hey, there may be payback that happens if I go against the chair too often. And so I think we sort of just want to try to ease it or make it easier for that potential recall or forced hearing to occur, and in part because it presumably would force the chair to maybe try to be more open or more willing to hear things and more willing to sort of be public about it. I think, although it's not written here, trying to be more specific about requiring the reasons, recommendation for deferral to be stated, I think would also make a lot of sense, and try to also force some of those discussions that Representative Ward was talking about to happen more publicly rather than always sort of being behind the scenes. I think those are all pretty easy recommendations to make.
And along those lines, I'm very open to pretty much all the suggestions made by Representative Ward in terms of making the process. And I didn't know I'd always be agreeing with them, but more democratic, more transparent. I think all his points are well taken.
Okay, why don't we move on to the next general topic is transparency and public access. Next slide, please. So I think I do want to recognize that as a result of COVID, there were pretty significant improvements to public access to be able to offer testimony, to be able to watch remotely. And I think it would really make a lot of sense for this commission to recognize that and support sort of continuing these these methods and protocols, sort of also encourage continuing to be in the forefront of using technology to allow greater public access. I think I have noted sometimes that if people didn't submit written testimony, they would not be allowed to testify orally. I think some chairs would enforce that rule and others would not. I could sort of maybe suggest, particularly with the limited time frame, sometimes hearings are, there's only a requirement for 48 hours notice. So if a notice comes out late Friday night for a Monday hearing, it may be difficult sometimes for people to get written testimony in within 24 hours, which is required. So if they don't stay up on Saturday getting testimony in, they may then be prohibited of speaking on a Monday hearing. I think we could try to encourage a more open attitude towards that, but again, sort of compliment and recognize the fact that the video access has been very beneficial. I don't think this is going to be a controversial proposal, so unless I keep seeing anything, I would, let's go ahead and jump to the next slide. Perhaps getting a bit more controversial, access to bill drafts. The intent here is to propose that any draft that somebody submits must be made public with a particular focus on conference committee. And I recognize that this is a very abbreviated timetable, and we'll talk about timing in a little bit. The concern being obviously is that, particularly in a conference committee, if a stakeholder submits wording choices at the last second and the public doesn't have an opportunity to see that, you may sort of have decision making made on, and again, laws are important, wording is important. If you don't see that ahead of time, or if you don't see that sort of in real time, then you don't necessarily have the opportunity to point out that there may be deficiencies or problems with that language. So the intent here is essentially to say, hey, if the legislature at large, staff or legislators are accepting drafts, and that's something that's going to be operated on, that's potentially something that gets posted publicly and made available to see. Here I wrote eliminate the ability to submit bills by request, but I would make a friendly amendment to my own slide and say maybe allow bills to be submitted by request, but also indicate who requested it, so it's public of where it's coming from. Any discussion?
Well, on the amendments to bills, now you have a hearing on a bill. The committee report comes out with the recommended changes, quite often explain why. Decision of the committee. There's a certain period, I forget how many day or 48 hours before it goes to the floor. It has to go through at least 2 readings, and then the other house. To me, that's adequate. You know, one of the things, I started appearing in the legislature in 1984. That's how old I am. And everything was hard copy. You had to go down, you had to go through. And it is so easy today with everything online to track bills, to follow bills. And now with the Zoom on top of it to participate, even with written testimony, all you do is have to check the box for or against. That's written testimony. And then you can appear. So I pretty much think the process is fairly good. As far as the by request, I'm for either doing away with by request or putting down the name of the requester.
I do think, Robert, that you are right, that attention needs to be paid to drafts of the conference committee's work, because that's under a very tight time schedule, and we don't always see every conference draft. It isn't always published in a timely way. So it's quite different than the normal lead up to conference where the public has 48 hours.
Well, you do see the conference draft coming back to both houses, right? And with time.
So you will see it typically before it goes to vote on the floor, but at that point, the opportunity to make change is very
The
difficult.
problem I see with that, conference committees are really in negotiation. That's what they are. You have 2 committees negotiating. Some of it may be in writing, some of it may be in oral. It's usually near the end of the the session. It's a very tight timeframe.
Mhm.
I don't know how practical that is.
So I think the intent here is any draft submitted to the legislature. So I think the intent is, for example, if a lobbyist hands a draft to a legislator and says, here's what I think you should do, that is what's being.
I have no problem if we specify the lobbyist hands it
Yeah,
down.
so I mean, it says submitted to the legislature.
Yeah,
I think the intent is really to, capture more of the external influence,
Well,
saying,
you know,
here's
that's
what I,
really
here's what I want,
interesting
here's what I
point,
want you
because
to.
The conference committee doesn't allow testimony, right?
that's right.
Right.
So if you have an outsider submitting a draft, in essence, that's testimony.
That's
I
right.
think it's pretty common for chairs, others to talk to stakeholders and to get input. So I'm not necessarily saying that we really want to curtail the ability to talk to stakeholders even during the conference committee. But I think the intent is that if, a substantive draft, and again, there'll be obvious loopholes around this. You just won't hand a draft and orally discuss it. But I think particularly on very complex pieces of legislation that may be 40 pages long, sometimes, that comma or that and can be really significant. If you have a very clever, I'll blame lawyers here, handing drafts there, that can be really significant. I think the opportunity to try to make that
How's that
public.
going to work with the state budget? I mean, you have all these people approaching conference committee members, this item, that item, government agencies, nonprofits. And you have a deadline because it's the end of the session. I mean, how can that practically work?
Maybe there would need to be a carve out for the appropriations bills, but if members of the public or lobbyists are submitting proposed conference drafts, and that is shared between the two negotiators, I do think it's appropriate that that be made available.
If you can come up with wording, I'd look at that, the lobbyist draft. But as a general rule, I don't find it real practical.
Okay. I think, again, just not trying to lose this again, we've had other discussions, for example, on lobbyists requiring to disclose actual bills that they are working on, not just categories. The intent, I think, is to try to make it a bit more public what people are engaging on. And again, I think the intent is external influence. So I would have no problem, for example, and I think the intent would be trying to make some of this information more public. For example, we've talked about the fiscal ramifications of trying to make some of those reviews maybe more public, recognizing that's going to be a whole conversation. I don't know necessarily is trying to make it awkward for government agencies to talk. Again, I certainly understand that some level of communication is going to have to happen, but trying to make a preference for trying to make some of it more public rather than having a bill live or die based on something that's happened that nobody's
Right.
actually has a chance
And
to
we
see.
should remember that most of the time, this external suggestion is going to be in the format of an electronic document. Either an email or a letter or a draft bill. So it may not be as difficult as we think.
I think the key would be how you write that up.
So this is how, and I'm holding up a cell phone here, this is how the third house communicates with members during conference, often during non-conference committees. So with respect to the budget process, perhaps it should be incumbent upon, advocates to submit to the ethics committee those budget items that it is working on in a given session. I think that's a very reasonable disclosure requirement, and that shouldn't take too much effort on the part of the lobbyists. Obviously it's a little bit more work for the ethics commission to take that in, but again, these are done online now, right? So you can just plug it in. You don't even necessarily have to specify the number of hours, just say, this person was working on this budget item.
I think the challenge will be for nonprofit advocacy groups like Common Cause who maybe are testifying at 40 bills to actually have to record the 40 bills. I mean, there is going to be some level of work there.
We have that information anyway, right? So.
Yeah.
And we don't typically, do budget advocacy on, although some of the other organizations I'm affiliated with do, and often out of necessities. But again, yeah.
All right, I think we've had some good discussion. Thank you. If we can move to the next slide. So this we've heard before too, is trying to make access to public testimony more available. The intent here, and some committees do a good job of this, of trying to make the testimony available 24 hours in advance of the hearing. I do have to admittedly recognize there are some challenges with this. Again, if you have 48 hours notice for a hearing, that by dint of necessity would then mean all the testimony has to be submitted, within 24 hours and potentially even less. A lot of times legislative staff are actually reviewing the testimony to make sure it's actual real testimony and not just bots or sort of spam stuff or completely unrelated profanity, etc. And so there is some filtering process that does already go on. That being said, it is entirely rational to say that when advocates show up to a hearing that they should know sort of what other people are saying. Legislators should have time to see it before they show up to hearing. And so a lot of this will go back to sort of the last stage, which is if you make the session longer, a lot of these things just get a lot easier. Or if you have more breaks, a lot of these things get easier because you have more time to kind of build in some of this access capability. I think even if you don't change the session, though, there is an opportunity to explore things like, anything that's filed is automatically posted, and you can start trying to limit more to registered people on the Capitol website. So that maybe eliminates some of the spam or bots capability. And if somebody does something that is profane or something, you're able to then know exactly who filed it because they logged on to the website and submit their testimony. The challenge with obviously proposing that is then potentially making it more difficult for people to testify because they would all have to register at the Capitol website. These are all trade-offs I think we have to sort of get into a little bit more. We pause there. Any input?
I would like to note that I feel very strongly that even late testimony that comes up to the time of the committee date be available online subsequently, even if it's marked late. I don't think I understand that there are staff concerns and that there are resources concerns, but if somebody has made the effort to submit testimony before the hearing, written testimony before the hearing begins, I think that our institutions owe it to the public to ensure that their testimony does appear online. Even I have had testimony just kind of get lost down the hole like that. So I speak from experience on that front.
My experience monitoring the legislature submitting testimony, it is posted before the hearing begins online. And I don't know how uniform it is, Nicholas, but I have observed that they also post late testimony in staff.
Yeah, not always though, unfortunately.
I think that is that's the best example.
Yeah.
I'd say that's, and again, maybe it's changed over as time's gone on, it's gotten better. But it's not always the experience, and it's frustrating to be testifying on something and somebody says, well, I introduced evidence of X, and nobody else can see it, and it's really hard to try to talk about something like that without being able to see it.
I thought Rep Ward made an excellent point about data and how much we have to rely on external testifiers to provide solid scientific or rational data. When I see that, it's always impresses me. It adds a lot of value.
Shall we jump to the next one? So this will be very brief. Go ahead and skip to next time. So one thing that we potentially can do with a little, so the this is subject to potentially us getting feedback from others. I think under the current constitution, there is sort of a specific date that the session starts. And then we sort of have an external date of sort of, you can't get too close to the primary election. So the wiggle room of how much you can extend the calendar currently is somewhat confined. The 60 days is in the Constitution. You can put in recesses in between and essentially stretch out that 60 days over time. And so one recommendation could be is to trying to break those recesses a little bit more with an emphasis on trying to give more opportunity for people to get a 2-day period, before seeing things. You're just trying to like ensure that the transparency of some of the stuff is greater. But I do think there's probably a very limited amount of wiggle room that exists currently without potentially looking at a constitutional revision to start the session sooner, et cetera. But again, it does feel like if you were able to take more time, things like sunshine, transparency, notice, opportunity to testify, those things just get a little bit easier. We have more time to be able to do it out.
Yeah, the interesting thing is, since we've taken the position and a bill's been passed, no fundraising during sessions and possibly even solicitation or acceptance, the longer the session, you're essentially barring them from raising funds prior to the election. So, various proposals, interact, as well as a number of bills being introduced and a number of hearings. So that the more hearings you have, the more bills you have introduced, the longer the session, is. So every single proposal impacts another proposal. One of the things too is the key thing are committee hearings, which don't have to be on session days.
Correct. I mean, I think the intent, what I'm trying to get at here, and the easy example is probably conference committees, but well, it's not the easiest example, but it's probably one that's most needed. Again, generally speaking, each subject committee has about 2 weeks to try to move through a bunch of bills. And so the idea would be is potentially you could notice a bunch of bills, and make that a 3-week period, for example. And that by making a 3-week period, you're able to get more notice, and you're able to stretch out the hearings a little bit more, so people have more opportunity to respond, react, and give that input. And that's just sort of an example of trying to stretch it a little bit longer. But again, I think there's probably a limit to how much you could really do that with the current constraints.
I'm all for more time, more notice, more consideration, more transparency, but how to do it is the difficult part.
I think it can be potentially a sort of operating with the current confines recommendation about trying to do breaks. And again, the specific on conference committee is, again, usually you have a very narrow time frame for conference committee to make a decision, and then it will go to floor vote. And so one opportunity to try to, for example, before a conference committee votes on the proposal, maybe the proposals have to be noticed on a Wednesday, and then the vote happens on Friday. So there's some opportunity to review what they're going to be voting on and have some input on that, because sometimes we have significant changes that happen and the public may not see that until after the conference committee is already finished, and some level of input and ability to change it has been lost.
And you also have, I think with Senator Lee or Senator Rhodes said, you also have the human factor. Regardless of where your deadline is, that's where they end up at the end of the session, crunch time, near the deadline. I was a legislative counsel for 8 years. And regardless of what legislature, what type of session, it always happens. Everything comes crunch time at the end.
Yeah, and again, I don't think that what I propose now necessarily changes that. Again, if you had a notice deadline of, say, Wednesday, that would be your crunch time, right? You'd be crunching to try to get everything noticed, and then you actually do a vote on Friday. the idea is you had to get everything done by Wednesday still, so that effect of pressure and crunch is still there. But then you also have the opportunity for someone to say, whoa, that was a drastic change. You should probably think about that before you go on Friday.
I think all your ideas in this presentation are excellent, Robert. The devil's in the details, always how to write it out.
I think that's a good summary of this commission in general. So I think that effectively ends the presentation. Chair, I sort of turn it back over to you. I think part of the discussion we wanted to have on today's hearing was essentially how do we move forward from here? And so, recognizing now we sort of have to do the devil in details, that's probably a great segue.
Before you get to me, Robert, did you want to discuss your nepotism bill?
Sure. I'll just give a brief overview and sort of ask if anybody has any input. The intent with this nepotism bill is to create a bright line about the hiring and supervising of family members. Currently, there is already some level of restrictionness under the fair treatment. You can't give unwarranted privileges or something to someone special. And so there's some level of ability to capture this. But by creating the bright line, it really does sort of, give clear direction, and it sort of takes away some of the ambiguity behind this. The intent is to not stop existing relationships that may already be in place. It's a going forward. It is maybe more narrow, discrete than what some others might propose. But I think, again, the idea of a bright line is to try to keep it narrow and discrete.
Would you tell the commission how this was drafted and whether there was any model or other jurisdiction that was looked at?
We looked at 2 different states, and unfortunately, I don't remember the states, but I think we did try to pick and choose from 2 examples and try to take the best from both. I think, yeah.
Right.
Robert, I had a couple of minor suggestions. I thought it would be helpful to add a definition of member of the household. And in the clauses where you're talking about restricted activities such as appointing, employing, or promoting, I also thought it would be helpful to add a restriction on performance appraisal or performance evaluation. I'm glad you did this.
Thank you for the comments. If the commission's okay, and we can certainly talk about how we want to handle drafts going forward, but I think what I would probably do is work with Casey at the stage to try to get his input on it and sort of see if there's any sort of more technical, non-substantive changes or otherwise that he proposed, and at some point he'd come back to us to sort of maybe have a vote to say this is one of those we'd like to propose.
Yeah, I'm all for that.
Great, thank you.
Okay, if there's nothing further on Robert's section on legislative process consideration of nepotism bill, we have to discuss item number 6, discussion for future meetings and next steps. I did look through our interim report, and at the very end, it talked about everything we were going to consider after that interim report was filed, and we've pretty much done that.
Amazing.
Yeah, we've done a really good job. So the areas we've covered is ethics and gifts, election law, modernization, campaign finance, reform, criminal prosecution and fraud, open government laws, and legislative process. And we've had a leader of each one of those discussions. So one of the things I see, one of the reasons why Flo is not here today, that law enforcement working group is actually working on their bill package, to present to us for consideration. And I think that's what we need now is in each one of those sections from the members of the commission that led that section is ultimately, have a commission meeting and look at a bill or look at proposed rule changes for consideration and decision making. That's my thought, Robert.
Agreed, I guess I'd also flag that maybe some of the sessions we potentially walked out, not necessarily with a firm, this is what we're gonna do. So I think bill drafts are a great idea to the extent where we know that there's some directionality, or bill drafts to the extent that we want to start that conversation. But I guess maybe part of the discussion today I was hoping for is like, if we think we need another discussion, and I'll give an example. We've had a lot of discussions recently on, and sorry, Kristen, I'm maybe throwing you under the bus here, on campaign finance. Do we need to have another discussion on sort of other specific recommendations that we want to discuss more? Just trying to make sure that we've utilized the time that we have to get outside input, public input, et cetera, and or try to use it to formulate our opinions better.
Kristen, I mean, you led one of the sections, campaign finance. Do you have any comments on Robert's point?
No, I can appreciate where Robert's coming from. And I think just reviewing all of the public testimony that has come in, there's always tends to be a campaign finance element to it or comment to it. We, based upon our presentation, we have potentially about 15 bills, which would be a record for us. I mean, and as you probably know, we're in the middle of an election too. And there's only 5 of us, but we're doing our best. We are starting drafting. But of course, I also have a commission, and I've completely kept them apprised of what this special commission's been doing. And would, of course, like to share with them what some of the bills look like. But I think it can be a collaborative process too. But I will defer to the committee if you believe that some item or topic contained within campaign finance needs to circle back and receive more public comment or testimony or more dialogue or discussion as we move forward in our bill drafting. And I think in my PowerPoint presentation, I tried our best to lay out the kinds of bills that we're drafting right now so that it's very public as far as what we as a commission, what we're thinking for campaign finance reform.
Kristen, I have not seen the list of bills on campaign finance reform that Senator Rhodes mentioned last week. And I'm interested, of course, to see what's happening in other states. Have you had a chance to look at his list? And
no, that's a great point. I was hoping that maybe I didn't get it because I wasn't physically at the building. So I would love to see that too.
Sure.
Chair, do you have that? Or I can ask Senator Rhodes to send an electronic copy and we can circulate that as well.
Yeah, the only copy.
I remember that copy. It was a National Conference of State Legislatures handout on restrictions on fund. It might have been specific to restrictions on fundraising during the session or general.
I think I pushed it this way, so it may have just been left or put in the pile somewhere in this direction.
Yeah.
I'll make sure I get a copy. I can ask Senator Rhodes for it as well and circulate it again.
I think we need to maybe hold some sort of public forum on the issue of super PACs and how we can rein in or increase disclosure requirements on super PACs. I don't know if that's one of the 15 bills that you're working on.
Because one of the
right now.
things, we're running out of time.
Yeah.
We have 3 more months before our report is due. And we're going to have to be recommending specific bills and specific rule changes. So I think the sooner we get to them, the better, because our report will be written around them. Now, to begin considering specific bills or specific rule changes doesn't mean we can't keep talking about ideas, changes, it in no way limits us, but we have to start moving those things. And it's really up to, I know Flo's group, I don't have a time frame, but as soon as that's done, that will come in, but I can't tell you when. defer to Robert, Nicholas, Janet, and you, Kristen, that have led the groups. When you think you can come in, doesn't have to be with all of them at one time. That's not what you have, but if we can start getting stuff before the commission, and we also have to have Casey take a look at it, the form. And we have to start voting.
Maybe I'm sticking my neck out, but with the voting and elections area, except for term limits, I don't expect that there will be a lot of bills drafted. So if it's helpful, I would try to go in September.
Okay.
And whatever I can amass related to that topic, I would try to have it ready in September.
Because is the thought trying to consolidate the bill reviews based similarly as to the presentations by specialty?
Yes, that would be, to me, the easiest way to approach it,
Sure.
because we have one commissioner or two commissioners that led a session that's working on this, and that commissioner could lead the session on the bills or the rule changes and that category. I think it'd be easiest to do.
Because I hope you'll help me on that topic. Also on the transparency
Sure.
topic.
So that would be Janet and Nikos, you've been, you're part of it.
Yep,
You're such.
happy to do it.
So Robert, do you have any idea when we could be looking at ethics bills?
I think this is, I probably need to have the conversation with Casey to sort of know how much time he's gonna take. So I think that is a part of it as well. I mean, my hope is to give him more complete drafts. So maybe the time frame will be shorter, but I'm not sure if I'm able to commit to something.
And that's okay.
But I mean, I'd be shooting for in the 4-week to 6-week range would be sort of my ideal.
How about you, Christian? When would you think some bills would be ready for the commission to look at?
I will try in September, probably will be difficult, but maybe by October. I think the hard one for us is going to be the large ones like public funding, and of course, my position has been, and I'm certain there'll be feedback. But at this point in time, if the commission is going to set forth a bill, a proposal, it will probably be to boost the partial public funding, not full, because, absent more funding and a very distinct vision as to what full public funding will look like, it would be very difficult for this, our office to front a full public funding bill. So having said that, we're looking at how we can propose something, but there are also some lower hanging fruit as far as bills are concerned. So like I said, I'm in the process of drafting some right now. I'm hoping I can present it at least to our commission at our September meeting. So that's why I'm trying to shoot for October to present it to this commission. Does that make sense?
Yes. And like I say, with Flo's group, they're working on it as we speak. And hopefully that will be within a matter of weeks. So that would give us something on ethics, elections, campaign finance, criminal prosecution and fraud. That leaves open government laws and legislative process. Janet, Nicholas, you did.
Yeah, we did the open government. We once again, I don't see a long list of bills coming. If anything, what we've come up with is a long list of legislative process rule changes. So the two are slightly different.
Right.
So I think the open government, open process material. What do you think, Nikos? When could we have that done, do you think? October?
Yeah.
Okay, so
October is-
open government, we got you down, and nobody's being held to this.
Right,
You can
right.
only do it when you do it.
Right,
But we have voting, we're shooting for September, open government, we're shooting for October. Ethics, we're shooting for 4 to 6 weeks. Campaign spending, we're shooting for October. Government prosecution and fraud should be coming to us in a matter of weeks. And the legislative process, that kind of overlaps with the open government, right?
sort of.
Do you have any suggestions on time frame for rule changes on that one?
We're also looking sort of in the October timeframe, which is making me think perhaps we should be talking about meeting once a week in October or something.
Okay, so we're basically going to be, from what the discussion is, addressing these in September and October. And if we can deal with most of them in that time frame, that leaves us November, to put the report together. I will touch base, Rona, with Casey, because, I think the report has to be written as we move along. We can't
Right.
start writing in November. And we did that with the interim report, and it worked out very well. And I've discussed with Casey before. I'll follow up with him. And as I told you when I began chairing this commission, I chaired a number of commissions, a special master, and COVID and whatnot, and there's always a time frame that's impossible. So you have to write the report as you move along. And I think with Casey, we did it before, you can do it again. So I think we have a sense of that. The next thing is.
I would
scheduling.
like to suggest that as we go along, we try to reach consensus on the priority of the bill. Is it high priority, medium, or low? Because we'll have a long list
Yeah,
of bills, and I think it helps convey our ideas to the public if we can express
well, I think you did that well with our.
how important we think this is.
I think that comes in fashioning the report, and I think you actually did that, Janet, with our interim report and how we organized it. And I think we need to do that again.
Right,
But I think all bills are important. I remember in our interim report, the Ethics Commission and the Campaign Spending Commission had what they called housekeeping bills.
right.
Those are really important. Anything that helps an agency carry out its mission, to me, is an important thing. And so that when you're coming up with bills, Christian, and also Robert, even if we haven't specifically discussed something, you're putting it together, it's going to make your commission more effective. And both commissions are within the mandate of our House Resolution number 9. Bring them forward. And we can do what Janet does, the sort of, as we did with the interim report, we put the sort of housekeeping bills, miscellaneous bills at the end. And we did prioritize, put the more important bills, and we can do that again. I think that's important. It's important not only for the legislature, but for the community and the press that will be covering our report.
It makes it easier for the press to understand where we're going.
Yeah. The other thing we have to do today, and Christian, you brought up that we had kind of an agreement how we were going to schedule, and then we broke it. So everybody who penciled in their calendars worked around it. That whole plan was destroyed. So we're right now, I'm going to start with you, Christian, to help us get back on track. I did email all of you. There's going to be about a 4 to 6 week period where I won't be available. Robert will be chairing, so don't worry about me. I will follow, Christian, you have a suggestion in terms of future scheduling? Barbara, what was the time Barbara said?
Barbara said she's not available on the 4th Wednesday of each month.
Okay, so the 4th Wednesday of each month is out. We're not going to do that because we need Barbara. But other than that, Christian, do you have a suggestion on scheduling?
Well, I mean, I just marked from the outset, so to work around it. what this commission had proposed. I think it was Robert. And so my next meeting I have is September 7th, then the 21st, then October 5th, the 19th, et cetera, et cetera. In other words, every other Wednesday. So I just sort of marked it on my calendar as a target. But I realize that with this next phase we're at, perhaps it may not be that fluid. So of course, I'll defer to the group what you propose.
Robert, any suggestions?
I think one proposal might be we could potentially take a break somewhat in September if people don't have a specific thing that they want to bring up. But with the idea that that time spent drafting and getting stuff, the idea that we meet every week, unfortunately, in October to try to get through the drafts that start coming in. Again, I'm happy to meet in September. It's not that, again, the question would be, what would we be talking about in September?
Okay, so let's first look at October and then look back at September. Could we meet? Anybody object? October 5, 12, 19. And then the last one, I'm going to put down anyway, even if Barbara can't make it. So that would be the Wednesday, 2 p.m. every week in October.
I unfortunately will not be available the second week of October.
I can do that one. I'm not another person, so that's okay. And then for September, we'll try to do this by email. If we could also have some, like if Flo's group is done, and we can schedule that in September, we'll do it by email. And we'll do it on a Wednesday. This can be at 2 p.m. That's convenient for everybody.
Oh, that just made me think of something. Will we need to take a vote or, have a discussion on the proposed measures? It's entirely possible we won't all agree.
That's okay. That happened with our interim report.
Right.
So I think what we need is we have a majority to recommend it. And a commissioner that disagrees, we note that disagreement.
Okay,
And we did that in the interim report, and that's fine.
that's right.
It may come down with something like term limits,
Mhm.
where we have a difference of opinion.
Mhm.
And difference of opinion is fine. But the point is, if we make a recommendation, even with a difference of opinion, it's before the legislature.
Yeah,
And that's important. And I think the way we did in the interim report, I liked it, as opposed to a majority report and minority report. You just put it right in the body. Commissioner, Harris disagrees for this reason.
Mhm.
Something like that.
okay.
Yeah. So we'll try to, if anybody can get their work done, and I'll contact with Flo, and we can schedule a September meeting, we should do that. Otherwise, we're gonna have to cram it all into October. I'll touch base with Casey and Rona. Can you share my thoughts with Casey in the interim? That the report's going along, we just then have to stick the bills in and what we've decided and attach them as appendices and whatnot. Could be a very lengthy report with the overall summary, the minutes of the proposed bills and resolutions. Although, Janet, we haven't voted on anything yet, I really get the sense, having participated in these meetings, that we do have sort of a consensus generally where we're going. We're all going for more transparency,
Right.
for more disclosure, for more democratic participation in the legislature.
We're not all going for mandatory minimums. We are not all going for
Yeah,
mandatory
that's going- We'll
minimums.
have to wait and see the bill.
Right.
That's controversial, mandatory minimums, and the law enforcement coalition is going to recommend something.
Mhm.
It doesn't mean that we will recommend all the same. Mandatory minimums, I told Steve and I told Flo, those are controversial areas because it goes beyond just campaign spending. It's the whole criminal justice system and the legislature and certain community groups and study groups are trying to move away from mandatory minimums. So, that's an area we may all agree, Janet, not to have mandatory minimums.
We may.
Even though the Law Enforcement Commission is recommended.
Sure. Thank you.
Okay, I think we're making a lot of progress. And nothing prevents us, we're not under the sunshine law from emailing one another. If you're working, for example, if somebody's working on term limits, I think that comes within your Kuliana. There's nothing wrong to send out, we're thinking of no term limits, or we're thinking of term limits of X number of years, to just kick it around.
Sure.
I think I sent you an email, all the commission members a number of weeks ago. Some of my thoughts on this, just to get it out there, not necessarily for you to agree, but just, this is what I'm thinking of, and not carved in stone either. But you take something like term limits, I think there's reasonable positions on, and we've heard them articulated. But I think there's overwhelming support, public support for term limits. And I think term limits goes to restoring some trust. This is just my view in the legislative process. So I support term limits, even though I respect the arguments against them. Also, along the lines of term limits, the thing I put out there is 16 years. Some people may think that's too long, but at the same time, it recognizes the arguments against term limits, that it's long enough for people to have institutional knowledge to counter the weight of lobbyists and staff, etc. And it's something, if it's prospective, it may pass. So those are my thoughts. But if somebody comes back with a different number of years, I'm open to consider it. So I think those are the discussions we will be having. We don't have to wait for a public hearing. We can share them. Ultimately, whatever we're sharing will come out to public hearing. So we're not hiding anything. But so when we come to a public hearing that goes 2 hours or less, we know what's going to be coming. We can't, it's like people say, well, we need testimony in advance of the hearing. Well, this kind of testimony in advance of the hearing, so everybody can consider it. And when we come together, we'll put it all out there. For those watching on YouTube, nothing will be done in private. There will be no secret deliberations or decisions. It will be all done in public in this format. And whatever we recommend will be going to the legislature, hopefully introduced, whether it's by request or not. And then again, the legislature will start holding public hearings. So the public will have additional opportunity to testify and make recommendations. So this is an ongoing process. So we don't have our next meeting scheduled in September. We do have a meeting scheduled October 5, but we may have a meeting before then, depending what's ready to consider. Is that it? Does anybody else have anything else?
Chair, if I may, maybe this is kind of going into Janice's conversation about prioritizing, but I think more from the narrative of the report, I think it'd be important to try to recognize maybe whether it be a theme or if it's recognizing a specific concept as sort of being, I don't think there are any silver bullets to be clear, but sort of maybe a bit more transitionary. It's going to make a bigger impact if they're trying to be able to highlight a few concepts. Again, kind of going with Janice's comment. Really saying this is kind of a systemic reform that's needed. So for example, more sunshine transparency, you talk about sort of like that gives some specifics, the idea that this is sort of transformative and how what it does. And for us as a group trying to pick 3, 4 of those type of transitionary kind of bigger ideas that we're able to kind of highlight. in the narrative, the body, and then, you know, you can obviously have bills that are related to that or tied into it, but the idea is these are certain themes that we think are important to work on.
I really like that idea. And at least two of our resource people suggested that we would not be able to get everything we wanted to do done. And so we had to, you know, try and pick up big ticket items.
Yeah, well, even with regards to, I mean, some may be a big ticket item. So for example, some of the stuff that Flo's coming up with on the criminal side of things may be a big ticket item. But I
Right.
think transparency and sunshine, for example, it's gonna be a lot of little things, but the theme
Mhm.
is there. This is why they're all
Mhm.
important together. I think that one sort of chip back, chair respectfully, like one of the things I worry about term limits is it does suck the air out of the room, and that's what everyone will only talk about. And some of the other ideas may not be talked about. And my concern is term limits by themselves don't seem to have.
I don't think you can escape it. If we
Yeah.
don't recommend it, they'll talk about us not recommending it. So,
That's fair, but I
It's
mean,
gonna-
I think
it's
if you
gonna be-
put it in the list of four, for example, my fear is that's the only thing. that's
Well,
gonna
what
come
I
out.
would ask them, I think Janet and Janet, again, you did a really good job on doing that for our interim report.
Providing air.
No, and Robert's suggestion, so if the two of you don't mind putting your heads together and providing that sort of structure for the report,
Uh-huh.
and what should be highlighted in terms of themes, and suggest something, we'll send over to Casey into how to organize the report, because I think it should be done for the reasons the two of you have stated.
I think we also have to give some level of opportunity for this group to try to propose what those 3 or 4 ideas would be.
Exactly.
For example, campaign finance is so core to, you know, a lot of public testimony that's come in.
Mhm.
Like, what theme are we gonna come out with regards to that? And just trying to, like, you know,
Well,
shape
I
it a
can
little
give
bit.
you my input right now. It's just how we've organized these public hearings. Each of those headings are fine, but you know, that's my input, but how you and Janet want to put something together and circulate it among the commissioners, and any commissioner, and Nicholas, Kristen, in the meantime, want to make any suggestions, but I'd ask Robert and Janet if you could to give us.
Mess around with it. Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, well, for sure, see you in October, but hopefully September. And we'll be talking to you through email and phone in the meantime. And thank you, Rona, for all your support. Okay, meeting is adjourned.